So, to start off, we're just going to give a basic definition of what is class, just so that everybody knows what we're talking about throughout the project. And the best definition that we could find to define class is, in common parlance, the term social class is usually synonymous with socio-economic class, defined as people having the same social, economic, cultural, political, or educational status. And when we're talking about class, we usually break it up into three different sections. You have the upper class, the middle class, and the lower class. Now, as you can see, the upper class makes up about 19% of the population. The middle class has the majority of the population in it with 52%, and the lower class has about 26% of the population in it. And chances are that in your lifetime, you've probably heard the phrase that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer. Well, this is what we're here to talk about, because it's true. Over the past couple of years, the middle class has been shrinking, and they haven't been getting richer and moving to the upper class. They've actually been getting poorer and moving down to the lower class.
When discussing economic inequality, it's important to look at its history to see its connection to the economy. Looking at the graph, I think one of the important things to note is that from the end of World War II in the 40s to the late 70s, our nation underwent massive economic growth and enjoyed great prosperity. Over this period, incomes had nearly doubled due to inflation. It's important to note that over this period of prosperity, the wealth was very well distributed. In the late 70s, the gap between the classes began to grow. As the second graphic shows, starting in 1979, after product prices began to increase, wealthier individuals' incomes began to increase at faster rates compared to those of other socioeconomic classes. This essentially means increased inequality, because wealthier people's incomes are growing at rates much larger than any other class, meaning they stay rich. The article suggests the cause of the large income gap is due to the increasing standard of living of lower and middle classes being recognized, meaning it's becoming costlier to live a normal life for the other two classes, which is effectively shrinking their incomes. Okay, so moving on to the current state of economic inequality. Economists aren't exactly sure how to measure economic inequality. However, measures involving income are the most commonly used examples. These are the current estimations for household incomes. Lower class is approximately $0 to $40,000, middle class is approximately $40,000 to $120,000, and upper class is approximately $140,000 plus. It's important to remember that all these measurements depend. For these numbers, I used a household size of 4. Depending on how many people are in the house and the area, these numbers may vary. I also think it's important to mention that someone's socioeconomic class does not necessarily determine poverty or a person's importance. It's easy to think that way when people are constantly subdivided into groups by class in economics. It's also important to mention that the middle class is thinning due to rising product prices and stagnant wages. These factors effectively shrink income. This is very detrimental to the economy because the economy relies on the middle class for consumption spending the heaviest. This brings up my next slide about social mobility in America. Like I explained on the last few slides, if the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, then how does one move up in economic status? It turns out the main answer is education. The increasing need for skill-based jobs that require degrees is increasing at its fastest ever rate, while jobs without these education requirements are remaining about the same in demand. So people with less money are clearly at a disadvantage for upward mobility in America. Additionally, the cost of attending college and attaining this education in the first place is gradually increasing. The result is not only a complication for those who are on the borderline of being able to pay, but also poses a problem to those who are stuck in poverty, who can't afford the high prices of school, or are discouraged from applying due to costs. At the current rate, it looks like the wealth gap could continue to grow for a long time.
So what is economic inequality? According to Coral Celeste Frazier, who has her MA in sociology from Princeton University, states that economic inequality is the enormous gap between the rich and the poor. There are many factors that create this gap, including the three most important factors: income inequality, pay inequality, and wealth inequality. Income inequality includes all types of income, whether it be through investments, salaries, bonuses, and even benefits. This is a term that brings the idea of household income into play and how the middle class is slowly shrinking, which we'll talk about more later on in the slides. Pay inequality includes only the annual payment your location of employment pays you. This can include bonuses as well. Wealth inequality is the total amount of financial assets you or your family has. This can include investments like stocks and bonds and even private pensions, which is a way for you to benefit money-wise after you retire. But how do we determine this inequality? One of the most used ways we determine inequality across each nation is called the Gini coefficient, because it encompasses all income, pay, and wealth factors. The Gini coefficient is a scale from 0 to 1 of the country's entire income distribution, but the higher the number or closer you are to 1, the more inequality. Any degree above 0.4 is associated with instability. The United States has a Gini coefficient of 0.41 in 2015.
There are many ways to measure class inequality. Wealth measures material prosperity, income measures money acquired through work, and consumption measures how much a household spends per year. It is difficult to measure class inequality because income can vary considerably over time. It may not reflect all economic resources, such as credit availability, government assistance, or accumulated family wealth. This is why many people argue that consumption is a better way to measure economic well-being. For example, a study found that the richest 10% of the population earn 9.6 times the income of the poorest 10%. Yet the top 20% of households by income accounted for nearly 40% of total expenditures, while the bottom 20% accounted for less than 10% of expenditures. This shows inequality because even though the top percenters are making so much more, the bottom 10 to 20 still account for a big amount of the consumption, leaving them with less leftover money after taxes, necessities, healthcare expenditures, etc. Where we find the most inequality is in wealth. We measure wealth inequality because people with great accumulated wealth may not receive much in way of income, but have less expenditure, while people who earn a lot but also have high expenses, such as childcare or tuition, may not consider themselves especially wealthy. This goes back to consumption. One household may make more income-wise but has less inherited wealth and more expenses, or consumption, due to family size or other factors. The same study from above found that top 1% have 28.2% of wealth, while bottom 40% account for less than 1.5% of wealth. A person can have class privilege depending on their wealth, income, and consumption. One of these variables is not enough to determine one's privilege.
One of the required readings for class was Nickel and Dimed, which touched based on the idea of poverty and if you could get by on minimum wage in various cities across the U.S. Barbara talks about the struggles and what's considered necessary expenses for surviving. The reason why we asked the previous question is because it's almost impossible to live off minimum wage. She talks a lot about how many minorities she worked with, which we will discuss later on in the slides, but her advantages allowed her to be put ahead of some people in poverty today.
So, taking it back to the question posed a few slides ago, is a job a ticket out of poverty? While numbers and statistics can often give you a clear answer on a subject, it's usually more effective and you're able to relate more when you hear real-life examples from actual people that have struggled financially. A lot of examples like this can be found in the book Nickel and Dimed. While there are numerous examples of struggling coworkers that Barbara Ehrenreich met while working at various low-paying jobs, these three coworkers in particular that she happened to meet while working as a waitress in Florida appear to have the most dire situations out of the bunch. So first off, we have Joan, who lives in a van parked behind a shopping center at night and showers in a co-worker's motel room. Then we have Tina, who pays $60 a night for a room at a nearby Days Inn with her husband since they have no car and the Days Inn is within walking distance of her job. And lastly, we have Gail, who pays $250 a week to live in a downtown flop house with an abusive male friend, but unfortunately doesn't have the money to pay the rent on her own. So as you can see from just these 3 short examples from the book, just having a job doesn't automatically guarantee you financial stability.
One of the readings we were assigned to read was called American Apartheid, Segregation and the Making of the Underclass by Douglas S. Massey from the University of Chicago. The goal of Massey's writing is to supplement William J. Wilson's theory that powerful economic and demographic forces transformed the social environment of the inner city during the 1970s. In his writing, he argues that the beginning of concentrated poverty and the creation of the socially and spatially isolated underclass were actually due to the racial segregation of the 1970s. Massey is able to elaborate on his findings by looking at 4 imaginary cities where one faces no racial segregation, one faces low racial segregation, one faces high racial segregation, and one has complete racial segregation. When he breaks down his theoretical cities, he is able to explain that a sharp increase in a group's poverty rate will produce concentrated poverty when it occurs under conditions of high segregation. He also notes that an increase in poverty concentration radically transforms the social and economic environment of poor neighborhoods. Regarding the creation of a socially and spatially isolated underclass, Massey states that geographic intensification of poverty occurs because the additional poverty is spread unevenly over the metropolitan area. In this case, racial segregation weakens the economic base of minority communities during periods of economic dislocation. A specific example comes from Massey's writing explaining how the process of segregation works. He explains that whites are able to benefit from segregation because it isolates higher rates of black poverty within black neighborhoods. These higher concentrations of black poverty then reinforce the connection in the minds of white people between black race and behaviors associated with poverty, such as crime, family disruption, and dependency. Segregation heightens and reinforces negative racial stereotypes by concentrating people who fit those stereotypes in a small number of highly visible minority neighborhoods, thereby hardening prejudice, making discrimination more likely, and maintaining the motivation for segregation. Another reading we read was called Trump Voters and the White Working Class by Stephen L. Morgan and Juan Lee from Johns Hopkins University. Their writing looked at the claim of whether or not white working-class voters were a crucial block of support for Trump in the 2016 presidential election. Morgan and Lee evaluate this claim by asking 2 questions. First, were Obama voters in 2012 a substantial portion of Trump's voters in 2016, and if so, were they disproportionately white members of the working class? Secondly, were eligible non-voters in 2012 a substantial portion of Trump's voters in 2016, and if so, were they disproportionately white and members of the working class? Their research found that among 2016 voters, 12.7% of Obama's 2012 voters and 46.1% of those who were eligible to vote in 2012 but did not vote that year ended up voting for Trump in 2016. Morgan and Lee proved that the education divide among whites provided Trump with a narrow path to victory.
In explaining white privilege to a broke white person, Gina Crosley Corrigan explains how frustrated she was when people told her she was privileged even though she was poor. She explains how growing up she had very little money and lived in a trailer park. However, after reading White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, she finally understood intersectionality, also known as the study of being privileged in one way but not another. For example, if you're white and poor, you're higher up in the privilege ladder than a poor black person. White people are widely represented in media in a more positive way. They are also represented more in history and in the founding of the United States of America, which gives them more of a sense of nationality. For example, the 4th of July represents independence for white people. However, during this time in history, black people were still enslaved. Additionally, white people are not singled out by cops. There are many more examples such as these where being white is quote-unquote better than being African American. There are many ways in which one can be privileged or underprivileged. For example, in sexual orientation, as in gay or straight, among others, your sex at birth, being female or male, being cisgender or not, your physical ability, your class, your citizenship, your race, and many more such as these. Just because you're a straight, white, middle-class, able-bodied male does not mean that your life is not tough. Recognizing privilege simply means being aware that some people have to work much harder just to experience the same things that you take for granted.